I sold my soul for 12 shillings and sixpence. That was the price the pawnbroker gave me for the only proof that I had ever been loved. The morning I walked into that cramped little shop on the edge of York, I was 5 months with child and had not eaten in 2 days. My fingers trembled as I placed the locket on the counter, and the old man behind it squinted at the gold through a scratched monocle, turning it over in his weathered hands as though it were nothing more than scrap metal. He did not see the initials engraved on the inside. He did not see the promises those letters once held, E and E, intertwined like two vines reaching for the same sun, Edmund and Eleanor, a love that was supposed to outlast war, outlast distance, outlast everything. But love, I learned, does not outlast hunger. It does not outlast shame. And it certainly does not outlast the silence of a man who never wrote back. I took the coins without bargaining. I could not bear to look at the locket any longer. Not when every glance reminded me of the night Edmund had pressed it into my palm beneath the willow tree at the edge of his father's estate. He had kissed my forehead then, his lips warm against my skin, and whispered that he would return before the leaves fell. That was the spring of 1842. The leaves fell that year without him. And the next. And the next. Until I stopped counting seasons altogether and began counting only the days until my child would arrive. 10 years have passed since that morning in the pawn shop. 10 years since I buried Eleanor Ashford in a shallow grave of my own making and became simply Nell, a seamstress in the village of Thornwick, a woman with no past and no future worth speaking of. I have built a life here, small and unremarkable, stitched together with the same careful precision I apply to the gowns I mend for the local gentry. I wake before dawn. I sew until my fingers ache. I walk my daughter to the village school and watch her disappear through the gate with a tightness in my chest that never quite fades. My daughter, Clara. She is the reason I survive. She is the reason I drag myself from bed on the coldest mornings. The reason I smile when the vicar's wife complains about the stitching on her hem. The reason I have not simply walked into the river and let the current take me. Clara, with her dark curls and her curious mind and her eyes the precise shade of winter sky. His eyes, Edmund's eyes. Every time she looks up at me with that particular tilt of her head, I see him, and the wound in my chest tears open fresh. She does not know who her father is. She believes the story I have told her since she was old enough to ask, that her father was a soldier who died bravely in service to the crown before she was born. It is not entirely a lie. Edmund was a soldier. And the man I loved did die, in a way, though his body went on living somewhere far from me. I have taught myself not to think of him. I have trained my mind the way one trains a horse, pulling sharply on the reins whenever it tries to wander toward memories I cannot afford to carry. The weight of remembering is too great. It would crush me if I let it, so I do not let it. I wake, I work, I tend to Clara, I sleep. And in between, I fill every silence with tasks, because silence is where memory hides. But tonight, memory has found me anyway. I am sitting by the fire in my small cottage, a half-finished gown draped across my lap, when the knock comes. It is late, nearly 9 o'clock, and visitors at this hour are rare in Thornwick. For a moment, I consider not answering. Clara is already asleep in the room we share, her breathing soft and even, and I have no desire to speak with anyone. But the knock comes again, more insistent this time, and I set aside my sewing with a sigh. When I open the door, I find Mrs. Pemberton standing on my step, her round face flushed with cold and excitement. She is the wife of the local innkeeper, a woman who trades in gossip the way merchants trade in silk, and I can tell from the brightness in her eyes that she has come bearing news she considers too valuable to wait until morning. "Oh, Mrs. Nell," she says, pushing past me into the cottage without waiting for an invitation. "You will never believe what I have just heard." She settles herself into the chair by the fire as though she owns it, her breath still coming in short puffs from the walk up the lane. I close the door slowly, buying myself a moment to compose my expression. Mrs. Pemberton's gossip rarely concerns me. I have made myself invisible in this village, a woman of no consequence, and that is precisely how I prefer it. What news could possibly bring you out at this hour? I ask, careful to keep my voice mild. She leans forward, her eyes glittering in the firelight. The Duke of Hartmore, she says, as though speaking the name of a deity. He is coming to Yorkshire, to Ashworth Hall. Word came this very evening that his party will arrive within the fortnight. The floor beneath me seems to shift. I reach for the back of the chair to steady myself, hoping she does not notice the way my knuckles have gone white against the wood. Ashworth Hall, I repeat, and my voice sounds strange to my own ears, thin and far away. Indeed, the old Ashworth estate. It has been empty these 20 years, ever since Lord Ashworth died without an heir. But it seems the Duke has purchased it. Can you imagine? A Duke, here in Thornwick. She clasps her hands together, practically trembling with delight. They say he is unmarried still, though he is past 30 now. And handsome, Mrs. Nell. They say he is terribly handsome, though rather cold. A man of few words. But perhaps that is what comes of fighting in the wars. I cannot speak. My throat has closed around a stone that will not be swallowed. Mrs. Pemberton continues, oblivious to my distress. Of course, he will need staff. Ashworth Hall has been shuttered so long, there is no household to speak of. The village is already buzzing with hopes of employment. She pauses, studying me with sudden interest. You are skilled with a needle, Mrs. Nell. Perhaps the Duke will require a seamstress. Perhaps I manage, though the word tastes like ash. She chatters on for another quarter hour, weaving elaborate fantasies about balls and garden parties, and all the ways the Duke's arrival will transform our sleepy village into something grander. I nod in the appropriate places, offer the appropriate murmurs of interest, but I hear nothing. My mind is 1,000 miles away, lost in a past I have spent 10 years trying to forget. When she finally takes her leave, I bolt the door behind her and stand with my back pressed against it, my chest heaving as though I have been running. Edmund. Edmund is coming here, to the very village where I have hidden myself, where I have raised his daughter in secret, where I have lived as a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life. It cannot be coincidence, and yet, what else could it be? He does not know I am here. He does not know I exist at all anymore. I have taken such care to disappear, to leave no trace of Eleanor Ashford behind. My letters to his estate were returned unopened in those first terrible months, and eventually I stopped writing altogether. I assumed he had forgotten me, or worse, that he had never cared at all, that the promises he whispered beneath the willow tree were nothing more than the idle amusements of a young lord with time to spare before war called him away. But now he is coming, and the walls I have built around my heart are crumbling like plaster in the rain. I move to the window and look out at the darkness beyond. The moon is hidden behind clouds, and the lane is nothing but shadow. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills I can no longer see, Edmund Blackwood is making his way toward me. He does not know it yet. Perhaps he will never know it. Perhaps I can stay hidden, keep my head down, avoid the village when his carriage passes through. It is a large estate. There is no reason our paths should cross. But even as I tell myself these things, I know they are lies. Thornwick is small. Everyone knows everyone. And Mrs. Pemberton has already planted the seed, suggesting me as a seamstress for the Duke's household. If word spreads, if someone recommends me, if Edmund himself should hear of a skilled needlewoman in the village and send for me, what then? I press my palm flat against the cold glass, feeling the chill seep into my skin. What then, indeed? Behind me, I hear the soft rustle of bedclothes, and I turn to find Clara standing in the doorway to our room, her nightgown pale in the dim light. Mama? Her voice is thick with sleep. Who was that lady? I cross to her quickly, kneeling so that our eyes are level. Just Mrs. Pemberton from the inn, darling. Nothing to worry about. Go back to bed. She studies me with those eyes, his eyes. and I feel my heart crack along familiar fault lines. "You look sad," she says. "I am not sad," I tell her, forcing a smile. "Only tired. Come. Let me tuck you in." I guide her back to bed and pull the quilts up to her chin, smoothing the hair from her forehead the way I have done every night since she was born. She is asleep again within moments, her trust in me so complete that she does not question my trembling hands or the catch in my breath. I sit beside her for a long while, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She is everything good that has come from my suffering. She is the light that found me in the darkest night of my life, and I will do whatever I must to protect her from the man who does not know she exists, even if that man was once the only person I ever loved. I do not sleep that night. I sit by the fire until the embers fade to gray, my mind churning through possibilities and fears. By the time dawn breaks over Thornwick, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I have made a decision. I will not run. I have run far enough. I will stay here, in the life I have built, and I will be invisible as I have always been. Edmund will come and go from Ashworth Hall, attending to whatever business has brought him to this forgotten corner of England, and he will never know that the woman he once loved is living in a cottage less than 3 miles from his door. He will never know that he has a daughter. Some truths are too dangerous to speak, and some wounds are too deep to heal. I rise from my chair as the first light filters through the window, my body stiff from the long night. There is work to be done, a gown to finish, a life to maintain. I cannot afford the luxury of despair, but as I reach for my sewing basket, my hands pause of their own accord. I think of the locket, sold so many years ago for a handful of coins. I wonder where it is now, whether the gold still gleams as brightly as it did the night Edmund pressed it into my palm, whether anyone has opened it to read the initials engraved inside, or whether it sits forgotten in some wealthy woman's jewelry box, its secrets buried beneath layers of pearls and diamonds. I will never know, and perhaps that is for the best. Some things, once lost, are never meant to be found again. The fortnight passed like water through a sieve, each day slipping away faster than the last, carrying me toward a reckoning I could not escape. I tried to work. God knows I tried. I bent over my sewing table until my back screamed and my vision blurred, losing myself in the rhythm of needle and thread, in the familiar comfort of fabric beneath my fingers. But my hands betrayed me. I pricked my thumb so many times the thimble could not contain the blood, and I ruined 2 hems with crooked stitches that would have shamed an apprentice. Mrs. Whitmore, the vicar's wife, returned a bodice I had altered, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval as she pointed out the uneven seams. I apologized. I offered to repair it without charge. And when she left, I sat in the empty silence of my cottage and pressed my palms against my eyes until stars burst behind my lids. He was coming. Edmund was coming. And no amount of work could quiet the terror singing through my veins. Clara noticed my distraction, though she was too young to understand its cause. She asked me 3 times one morning why I had put salt in her porridge instead of sugar, and I had no answer that would satisfy her. I told her I was tired. I told her I had not slept well, and she accepted these explanations with the easy trust of childhood, kissing my cheek before skipping off to school with her worn leather satchel bouncing against her hip. I watched her go, my heart in my throat. She looked so much like him now. The resemblance had always been there, in the shape of her eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw, but it seemed to sharpen with each passing year. If Edmund were to see her, if he were to look at her face for even a moment, he would know. Any fool would know. I had to keep them apart. That was the only solution. I would keep Clara close. Keep her away from the village when the Duke was about. Keep her hidden in the safety of our small life. It would not be forever. He would grow bored of Yorkshire eventually, as all wealthy men grew bored of the country, and he would return to London, to his parties and his parliament and whatever mistress currently warmed his bed. I had only to wait him out. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The Duke's carriage arrived on a Thursday afternoon, just as the church bells struck 3. I was in the village at the time, delivering a finished gown to Mrs. Pemberton at the inn. I had timed the errand carefully, choosing an hour when I believed the roads would be quiet, but the thunder of hooves and the rattle of wheels reached me before I could retreat to the safety of the back rooms. "He is here!" Mrs. Pemberton shrieked, abandoning me mid-sentence to rush toward the window. "The Duke is here." I could not move. My feet had rooted themselves to the worn floorboards, and my lungs had forgotten how to draw breath. Through the grimy glass of the inn's front window, I watched the procession pass. First came 2 outriders on matching bay horses, their livery dark green and gold. Then the carriage itself, black and gleaming, pulled by 4 horses so perfectly matched they might have been carved from the same block of obsidian. And behind it, another carriage, smaller but no less elegant, presumably carrying servants and luggage. I pressed myself against the wall, praying the shadows would swallow me whole. The carriages passed within 20 feet of where I stood. If Edmund had looked out the window at that precise moment, if his gaze had drifted toward the inn, he might have seen me. He might have recognized the woman he once claimed to love, older now and worn thin by years of struggle, but still bearing the same face that had haunted his dreams. But he did not look. The carriage rolled past without slowing, and within moments it had disappeared around the bend in the road, heading toward Ashworth Hall. I released the breath I had been holding, my entire body trembling. "Was that not magnificent?" Mrs. Pemberton sighed, turning from the window with flushed cheeks. "Did you see the horses? And the carriage? They say he brought half of London with him, servants and cooks and a French wine steward." I managed a weak smile. Magnificent indeed. She studied me then, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You look pale, Mrs. Nell. Are you unwell?" "The heat," I said, though the day was cool and overcast. "I have been working too hard." She clucked her tongue in sympathy and pressed a cup of tea into my hands, insisting I sit and recover myself before walking home. I accepted the tea because refusal would have raised more questions, but I tasted nothing. My mind was 3 miles away, following that black carriage up the long drive to Ashworth Hall, imagining Edmund stepping out onto the gravel, surveying his new domain with those cold blue eyes. I wondered if he had changed. I wondered if the war had left marks on him, the way poverty and heartbreak had left marks on me. I wondered if he ever thought of me, or if Eleanor Ashford had faded from his memory like morning mist burned away by the sun. I wondered, and I hated myself for wondering. The days that followed were a particular kind of torture. Thornwick transformed overnight into a village obsessed with its new neighbor. Every conversation, every whispered exchange at the market, every gathering after Sunday services revolved around the Duke of Hartmore. What he ate, what he wore, which rooms of Ashworth Hall he had opened and which remained shuttered, whether he had smiled at the housekeeper or frowned at the gardener, whether he was kind or cruel, generous or miserly, lonely or content. I listened to these reports with a hunger I could not suppress, gathering crumbs of information about the man I had once known better than I knew myself. The Edmund of my memory had been warm and quick to laugh, a young man with ink-stained fingers and a passion for poetry that he hid from his father. But the Edmund these villagers described was someone else entirely. A man of few words and fewer expressions. A man who walked the grounds of his estate alone at odd hours, his greatcoat billowing behind him like a shadow. A man who had dismissed 3 servants in his first week for offenses no one could quite name. The war had changed him. Of course it had. War changes everyone. But I found myself mourning the boy he had been, the boy who had pressed wildflowers between the pages of his books and read me sonnets by candlelight. That boy had died somewhere on a battlefield far from home, and in his place stood a stranger who bore his face. I should have felt relief. A cold and distant duke was less likely to notice a humble seamstress than a warm and curious one. If Edmund had returned from the war unchanged, if he had walked through the village with open eyes and an eager smile, he might have seen me. He might have known me. But this new Edmund, this hollow man who kept the world at arm's length, would never look closely enough to recognize the ghost of his past. And yet I could not feel relief. I could only feel loss, compounded upon loss, until the weight of it pressed against my ribs like iron bands. 2 weeks after the Duke's arrival, Mrs. Pemberton appeared at my door again, this time with a proposition that stopped my heart. "Mrs. Nell," she said, her face bright with triumph, "I have secured you an interview at Ashworth Hall." I stared at her, unable to form words. "The Duke requires a seamstress," she continued, oblivious to my horror. "His housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, mentioned it at the market this morning. Several of the household linens are in need of repair, and there is talk of new draperies for the drawing room. I told her immediately that we had the finest needlewoman in Yorkshire right here in Thornwick. She clasped my hands in hers, squeezing with excitement. "Is it not wonderful? You are to present yourself at the hall tomorrow at 10 o'clock. "I cannot," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Her face fell. "Cannot? But why ever not?" I scrambled for an excuse, any excuse that would not invite further questions. "I am behind on my current commissions. Mrs. Whitmore's gown and the altar cloths for the church, and I could not possibly take on more work at this time." Mrs. Pemberton waved her hand dismissively. "Those can wait. This is the Duke of Heartmore, Mrs. Nell. Think of what it would mean for your business, for your reputation. If the Duke himself employs you, every family in the county will want your services." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And they say he pays handsomely. More than handsomely. You could afford a proper shop, perhaps even an assistant." I felt the trap closing around me. She meant well, Mrs. Pemberton. She had no idea what she was asking, no idea that she was pushing me toward the one man in England I could not face. To her, this was simply an opportunity, a stroke of good fortune for a struggling widow with a child to raise. How could I explain that this opportunity might destroy everything I had built? "I will consider it," I said finally, forcing the words through numb lips. "Consider it?" She laughed, a bright, tinkling sound that grated against my frayed nerves. "What is there to consider? You will go tomorrow, and you will impress them with your skill, and this time next month you will be sewing silk for duchesses instead of mending hems for vicars' wives." She left before I could argue further, already composing the story she would tell at the inn that evening. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Tomorrow. I was expected at Ashworth Hall tomorrow. I could refuse, of course. I could send word that I had fallen ill, that urgent business called me away, that I had reconsidered and found myself unworthy of such an honor. But any excuse would invite suspicion. The villagers would wonder why a woman in my position would turn down such an opportunity. They would ask questions I could not answer, and questions, once asked, had a way of leading to truths better left buried. The alternative was worse. The alternative was walking into Edmund's home, standing beneath his roof, breathing air that he had breathed. The alternative was praying that he would not see me, or that if he saw me, he would not know me. 10 years had passed. I was thinner now, my face lined with years of worry, my hair darker from lack of sun. Perhaps I had changed enough that he would look right through me, the way the wealthy always looked through servants. Perhaps, but perhaps was a fragile thing to stake my future upon. That night, I sat Clara down beside the fire and told her I had business at the great estate the following day. Her eyes widened with curiosity, and she peppered me with questions I could not truthfully answer. What was the house like? Was it as grand as the stories said? Would I meet the Duke himself? I deflected as best I could, promising to tell her everything when I returned, and she seemed satisfied enough to let the matter rest. But after she fell asleep, I sat alone in the darkness and stared into the dying embers of the fire. My hands would not stop shaking. I pressed them flat against my knees, willing them to be still, but they trembled on regardless, as though my body knew something my mind refused to accept. I was going to see him. After 10 years of silence, 10 years of wondering, 10 years of building walls around a heart he had broken without ever knowing it, I was going to stand in the same room as Edmund Blackwood and pretend I was no one. I did not sleep. I lay beside Clara in our small bed and listened to her breathing, memorizing the sound the way I had memorized so many sounds before: the creak of the cottage door, the whisper of wind through the thatch, the distant toll of the church bells. These were the sounds of my life now, the life I had stitched together from scraps and shadows. And tomorrow, I would risk it all. Dawn came too quickly, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose. I dressed with care, choosing my most presentable gown, a simple thing of dark blue wool that I had made myself 3 winters past. It was modest and respectable, the dress of a working woman who knew her place in the world. I pinned my hair back severely, hiding the strands of silver that had begun to thread through the brown. I scrubbed my face until it shone and bit my lips to bring color to them. When I looked in the small mirror that hung beside the door, I saw a stranger, a woman old before her time, with tired eyes and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. A woman who had once danced in ballrooms and dreamed of love, reduced now to hoping that the man she had loved would not recognize her face. I left Clara in the care of Mrs. Jennings, the elderly widow who lived 2 cottages down, claiming I had an errand that would keep me away until afternoon. Clara hugged me goodbye with her usual enthusiasm, and I held her perhaps a moment longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her small body against mine. "Be good," I whispered. "I will return soon." And then I walked out the door and down the lane, toward Ashworth Hall, toward Edmund, toward the past I had spent a decade trying to outrun. The hall loomed at the end of a long gravel drive, its pale stone facade watching my approach with 100 dark windows. It was beautiful, in the cold and imposing way that great houses are always beautiful, and I hated it on sight. This was the kind of place Eleanor Ashford might have lived, had fortune favored her. This was the kind of place where ladies took tea in sunlit parlors and never worried about the price of bread. I was not that lady. I had never been that lady, not truly. And now I was merely a seamstress, come to beg for work. The servants' entrance was around the back, a narrow door set into the stone wall like an afterthought. I knocked twice and waited, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the door opened, a harried-looking kitchen maid ushered me inside without ceremony, pointing me toward a dim corridor that led, she said, to the housekeeper's sitting room. I walked that corridor like a woman walking to her own execution, and with every step, I felt the weight of the past pressing down upon me, threatening to crush the fragile shell of the life I had built. Edmund was somewhere in this house, perhaps just above me, separated by nothing more than wood and plaster and a decade of silence. And I was about to discover whether the walls I had built were strong enough to keep him out. Mrs. Crawford was a woman carved from Yorkshire stone, all sharp angles and sharper eyes, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her forehead. She studied me across her small sitting room with the cool assessment of someone accustomed to judging others on sight. I stood before her, with my hands clasped and my gaze lowered, playing the part of the humble seamstress as though my life depended on it. Perhaps it did. "You come recommended by Mrs. Pemberton at the inn," she said, her voice clipped and precise. "She speaks highly of your work." "Mrs. Pemberton is very kind," I replied. "Kindness is irrelevant. Skill is what matters here." She rose from her chair and crossed to a cabinet in the corner, withdrawing a bundle of white linen. "This is a tablecloth from the formal dining room. It has been in storage these 20 years and suffered for it. Can you repair it?" She thrust the fabric toward me, and I took it with steady hands, examining the damage with practiced eyes. There were moth holes near one corner, a long tear along the hem, and stains that had yellowed with age. Difficult work, but not impossible. "I can," I said. "It will require new thread matched to the original weave, and the stains may not lift entirely, but the structure can be restored." Mrs. Crawford's expression did not change, but something in her posture relaxed by a fraction of an inch. "Very well. There are 6 more like this one, and the drawing room draperies require attention as well. The previous owner let everything fall to ruin." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You are a widow, I understand?" The question caught me off guard. "Yes. My husband died before my daughter was born." "A soldier?" "Yes." I swallowed the lie like bitter medicine. "In the wars." She nodded, a flicker of something almost like sympathy crossing her stern features. "Many good men were lost. You have my condolences, Mrs. Nell." I thanked her quietly, hating myself for accepting sympathy I did not deserve. My husband had not died in any war. My husband had never existed at all. But these were the fictions I had built my life upon, and I could not abandon them now. Mrs. Crawford showed me to a small workroom on the ground floor, a narrow space with a single window overlooking the kitchen garden. "It had been a storage room once," she explained, "but would serve well enough for my purposes. There was a table, a chair, and a lamp. Everything else I would need to bring myself." "You will come 3 days each week," she said. "Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. You will arrive at 9 o'clock and depart by 4. You will take your meals in the servants' hall with the rest of the staff. And you will confine yourself to the areas necessary for your work. The family quarters are not to be entered without explicit invitation." I understood. Of course I understood. I was a servant now, bound by rules that kept people like me invisible to people like Edmund. This was precisely what I wanted, and yet the words stung in ways I had not anticipated. "The Duke," I said carefully. "Does he often visit this part of the house?" Mrs. Crawford's expression hardened. "His Grace keeps to his own rooms and his study. He has no interest in domestic matters. You are unlikely to encounter him at all." Relief washed through me, so powerful it nearly buckled my knees. I thanked her again, promised to return on Tuesday with my tools, and fled the hall as quickly as dignity would allow. Outside, the autumn air bit at my cheeks, and I drew it into my lungs like a woman surfacing from deep water. I had done it. I had entered Edmund's house, spoken with his housekeeper, secured a position that would provide desperately needed income, and I had not been discovered. He had not seen me. He did not know I was here. I walked home through the golden afternoon, my steps lighter than they had been in weeks. Perhaps this would work after all. Perhaps I could labor in the shadows of Ashworth Hall, earn my wages, and slip away again without ever crossing Edmund's path. Perhaps the past would stay buried where it belonged. But even as hope flickered in my chest, a darker voice whispered in the corners of my mind. "You are playing with fire," it said, "and fire always burns." My first weeks at Ashworth Hall passed without incident. I arrived each morning through the servants' entrance, settled into my small workroom, and lost myself in the meditative rhythm of needle and thread. The household linens were in worse condition than Mrs. Crawford had suggested, damaged by years of neglect and the particular cruelty of moths. But I welcomed the challenge. Difficult work required concentration, and concentration left no room for dangerous thoughts. I saw little of the other servants. The kitchen staff nodded politely when I passed, but rarely engaged in conversation, and the housemaids were too busy with their own duties to pay attention to the quiet woman sewing in the corner room. I preferred it that way. The less I was noticed, the safer I was. Of Edmund, I saw nothing at all. True to Mrs. Crawford's word, he kept to the upper floors, emerging only occasionally to ride out across his lands or receive visitors in the formal parlor. I learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the corridor above my workroom, the distinctive rhythm of his stride, and each time I heard it, my heart seized in my chest and did not release until the sound faded into silence. But I did not see him. Not his face, not his hands, not the shape of his shadow falling across a doorway. He was a ghost in his own house, and I was grateful for it. 3 weeks into my employment, I encountered something that shattered my fragile peace. I had finished my work early that Thursday and was preparing to leave when one of the housemaids, a young girl named Molly, appeared in my doorway. Her face was flushed with excitement, and she clutched something in her hands that caught the lamplight with a familiar golden gleam. "Mrs. Nell," she said breathlessly, "look what I found. Is it not beautiful?" She held out her palm, and my blood turned to ice. The locket. Edmund's locket. The same locket I had sold in that cramped pawn shop 10 years ago. The same locket that bore our initials entwined on its inner face. It lay in Molly's hand like an accusation, its chain coiled around her fingers like a snake. "Where did you get that?" I whispered, and my voice did not sound like my own. Molly's excitement dimmed slightly at my tone. "I found it in Lady Vivian's room. She is the Duke's," she paused, searching for a delicate word, "companion. She arrived from London last week and brought 6 trunks with her. This fell behind the vanity when I was dusting. Lady Vivian. The name meant nothing to me and everything. Edmund's companion. His mistress, presumably. A woman who wore the locket he had once given me. I reached out without thinking, my fingers trembling. "May I see it?" Molly handed it over readily, pleased to share her discovery. "Is it not fine work? I have never seen gold so bright. And look, there are letters engraved inside." She reached to open the locket, and I pulled it away from her with more force than I intended. She stepped back, startled, her eyes widening. "Forgive me," I said quickly, pressing the locket against my chest. "I did not mean to startle you. I searched for words that would not betray me. I have seen a locket like this before, long ago. It reminded me of someone." Molly's expression softened with understanding. "Someone you lost?" "Yes." I swallowed hard. "Someone I lost." She nodded sympathetically, the way young people nod when they cannot truly comprehend the weight of loss. "You should return it to Lady Vivian's room," I said, pressing the locket back into her hands before I could change my mind. "She will notice if it goes missing." Molly agreed and scurried away, the golden chain swinging from her fingers. I watched her go, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. The locket was here, in this house, around the neck of Edmund's mistress. I sank into my chair, my legs no longer able to support me. The room spun slowly around me, and I pressed my palms flat against the table to steady myself. All these years, I had wondered where the locket had gone after I sold it. I had imagined it melted down for its gold, or buried in a jewelry box in some stranger's house, or lost forever in the vast, indifferent machinery of commerce. Never in my darkest imaginings had I pictured it here. Never had I imagined it finding its way back to Edmund, a silent witness to everything I had lost. How had it happened? The pawnbroker in York must have sold it to a jeweler, who sold it to another, who sold it again, until eventually it landed in some fashionable London shop where Lady Vivian spotted it and decided it would look pretty against her throat. She could not know what it meant. She could not know the promises it once held, the love it once symbolized. To her, it was merely a trinket, a bauble to complement her gowns. But Edmund knew. Edmund had given me that locket with his own hands, had watched me clasp it around my neck, had kissed the hollow of my throat where the gold lay warm against my skin. If he saw it now, if he looked closely enough to notice the initials engraved inside, he would know exactly what it was, and he would wonder how his mistress had come to wear it. I did not know whether to laugh or weep. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. I had sold that locket to survive, and now it had returned to haunt me, a golden reminder of everything I had sacrificed. I left Ashworth Hall that evening in a daze, my feet carrying me down the familiar lane without conscious direction. Clara was waiting for me at home, her face bright with questions about my day, but I could not bring myself to answer. I held her close instead, breathing in the scent of her hair, grounding myself in the solid reality of her presence. She was what mattered. She was why I had sold the locket in the first place, why I had given up love and pride and identity to become a nameless woman in a forgotten village. I had done it for her, and I would do it again without hesitation. The locket was gone. It had been gone for 10 years. Its reappearance changed nothing. But even as I told myself these things, I could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. The locket was a thread connecting past to present, and threads, once pulled, had a way of unraveling everything. The following Tuesday, I returned to Ashworth Hall with a knot of dread lodged beneath my breastbone. I half expected to find the household in uproar. Edmund demanding to know how his mistress had come to possess his lost locket, accusations flying like arrows. But everything was quiet. The servants went about their duties with the same efficient calm, and no one so much as glanced in my direction as I made my way to my workroom. Perhaps he had not noticed. Perhaps the locket meant nothing to him now, a relic of a youth he had long since forgotten. Perhaps Eleanor Ashford was as dead to him as she was supposed to be to the world. I tried to take comfort in this thought as I bent over my sewing, but my hands refused to cooperate. My stitches were crooked, my thread kept tangling, and twice I had to rip out entire seams and start again. By midday, I had accomplished almost nothing, and my frustration had mounted to the point of tears. I set down my needle and pressed my hands over my eyes, willing myself to calm. This was madness. I could not continue like this, jumping at shadows, flinching at every footstep, living in constant terror of discovery. I had to find a way to steady myself, to rebuild the walls I had let crumble. But before I could draw another breath, the door to my workroom opened. I looked up, expecting Molly or one of the other housemaids, and the world stopped turning. Edmund stood in the doorway. He was taller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply forgotten the commanding way he occupied space. His dark hair was threaded with silver at the temples now, and lines had carved themselves around his mouth and eyes, the marks of years and war and suffering. But his eyes were the same, that pale, piercing blue, like winter sky reflected in still water. Those eyes had once looked at me with love. Now they looked at me with nothing at all. I could not speak. I could not move. I could only sit frozen in my chair, my hands still pressed against the table, and wait for the recognition to dawn in his face. But it did not come. He glanced around the room with the disinterested gaze of a man surveying his domain, his eyes passing over me as though I were a piece of furniture. "Mrs. Crawford said I would find the seamstress here," he said, and his voice was deeper than I remembered, rougher, as though he had spent years not using it. "I require a button replaced on my riding coat. Can you manage it?" I opened my mouth, and for a terrible moment no sound emerged. Then, from somewhere I did not recognize, words came. "Of course, Your Grace. If you would leave the coat, I will attend to it immediately." He nodded once, a curt gesture that expected obedience, and turned to leave. But at the threshold he paused. His back was to me, his shoulders rigid beneath the fine wool of his jacket. "Have we met before?" he asked without turning. "Your voice sounds familiar." My heart stopped, simply stopped, as though someone had reached into my chest and squeezed it silent. "I do not believe so, Your Grace," I said, and it was the greatest lie I had ever told. "I am merely a seamstress from the village." He stood motionless for a long moment, and I could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but wait for the blow to fall. Then he shook his head slightly, as though clearing away a cobweb, and continued out the door, I heard his footsteps retreating down the corridor, growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. Only then did I allow myself to breathe again. He had not recognized me. I sat alone in the silence of my workroom, my body trembling with the aftermath of terror, and I did not know whether to be relieved or destroyed. 10 years, and he had looked right through me. 10 years, and I was nothing to him but a servant, a nameless woman with a familiar voice. Perhaps this was what I wanted. Perhaps this was the only way to survive. But as I picked up my needle with shaking hands, I felt something crack deep in my chest, some last fragile piece of the girl I used to be finally breaking beyond repair. He did not know me, and somehow, that was the cruelest cut of all. The days that followed were a study in careful invisibility. I learned Edmund's schedule the way a hunted animal learns the patterns of its predator. I knew when he took his morning ride, when he retreated to his study, when he dined alone in the vast formal room that echoed with the ghosts of parties never held. I timed my movements through the hall to avoid the corridors he frequented, and when I heard his footsteps approaching, I found doorways to slip through, shadows to melt into, corners where I could press myself flat and wait for danger to pass. He did not seek me out again. The riding coat appeared in my workroom with a note from Mrs. Crawford, and I replaced the button with trembling fingers, unable to stop myself from pressing the fabric to my face and breathing in the scent of him. Horse and leather and something else beneath, something I remembered from a lifetime ago when I had been young enough to believe in promises. I returned the coat the same day, leaving it with a footman rather than risk another encounter. But avoiding Edmund could not protect me from the other danger that had taken root in Ashworth Hall. Lady Vivian. I saw her for the first time on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after my encounter with Edmund. I was crossing the servants' corridor toward the kitchen when a door opened ahead of me, and she emerged in a rustle of emerald silk and French perfume. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, polished and precise, with auburn hair arranged in elaborate curls and skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. Her eyes were green, sharp, and clever, and they swept over me with the casual dismissal of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. But it was not her face that stopped my heart. It was the locket, the golden locket hanging from a delicate chain around her throat, catching the lamplight with a gleam that seared itself into my vision. She paused when she saw me staring, one perfectly arched eyebrow rising in question. "Is there something you need?" I forced myself to look away, to lower my gaze to the floor as a proper servant should. "Forgive me, my lady. I was merely admiring your necklace. It is very beautiful." Her hand rose to touch the locket, her fingers curling around it with proprietary ease. "A gift," she said, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "From an admirer who appreciated fine things. A gift." My throat closed around the word. Someone had given her the locket, and she wore it without knowing its history, without caring about the love and loss and desperation that had brought it to her neck. Or perhaps she did know. Perhaps that was why she wore it. She studied me for a moment longer, her green eyes narrowing with an interest I did not like. "You are the seamstress," she said, "the one from the village. Yes, my lady, I have heard you are skilled." She tilted her head, examining me the way one might examine a piece of fabric before deciding whether to purchase it. "I may have use for your services. Some of my gowns require alteration. I would be honored, my lady." She smiled, a thin curve of her lips that did not reach her eyes, and swept past me down the corridor. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air long after she had gone, cloying and sweet, and I stood frozen in her wake, my hands clenched so tightly my nails cut crescents into my palms. She was wearing my locket. The locket Edmund had given me under the willow tree, the locket I had sold to feed myself and the child growing inside me. And now it hung around the neck of his mistress, a trophy she displayed without understanding its worth. I did not know if I hated her or pitied her. Perhaps both. The summons came the following Tuesday. Lady Vivian required my presence in her chambers to discuss alterations to her wardrobe. Mrs. Crawford delivered the message with a tight expression that suggested she did not approve of ladies summoning servants for trivial matters, but approval was not required. I gathered my measuring tape and my pins and climbed the stairs to the family quarters for the first time since my employment began. Lady Vivian's rooms were at the end of a long corridor lined with portraits of Ashworth's long dead. I kept my eyes forward as I walked, refusing to look at the painted faces that watched my passage. At the end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar, and I knocked twice before entering. The chamber was everything mine was not. Vast and sunlit, with tall windows overlooking the gardens and furniture upholstered in pale blue silk. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, and the air was warm and heavy with the scent of roses. Lady Vivian sat at her vanity, her reflection watching me in the mirror as I entered. "Close the door," she said without turning. I obeyed, and the click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the perfumed silence. She rose and crossed to a wardrobe in the corner, pulling open the doors to reveal a cascade of silks and satins in every color imaginable. "Several of these no longer fit properly," she said, running her fingers along the fabrics. "The London modistes have grown careless. I require someone with a more attentive eye." I stepped forward, my professional instincts taking over, despite the tension coiling in my stomach. "If you would show me which gowns need attention, my lady, I can assess what alterations are necessary." She pulled out 3 dresses, laying them across the bed with the casual disregard of someone who had never wanted for anything. As I examined the garments, noting the places where seams could be taken in or let out, I felt her gaze on me, heavy and considering. "You are not from Yorkshire originally," she said. It was not a question. I kept my eyes on the gown in my hands. "I have lived here many years, my lady. But you were not born here. Your accent betrays you. There is something beneath the village speech, something more refined." She moved closer, and I could smell her perfume again, thick and suffocating. "Where did you come from, Mrs. Nell?" My heart hammered against my ribs. "I come from nowhere of consequence, my lady. Everyone comes from somewhere." She was standing directly behind me now, close enough that I could feel the heat of her body. "And everyone has secrets worth discovering." I turned to face her, forcing my expression into careful neutrality. "I am a widow with a child to raise, my lady. My only secret is that I work hard to provide for her. There is nothing more interesting to discover." Her green eyes searched my face, and for a terrible moment I thought she could see through me, could see the lies I had wrapped around myself like bandages over a wound. But then she smiled, that same thin smile from the corridor, and stepped back. "Perhaps," she said. "Or perhaps not. Either way, I find you fascinating, Mrs. Nell. There is something about you that does not quite fit." She dismissed me shortly after, instructing me to return the following week with the alterations complete. I fled her chamber with my arms full of silk and my mind full of terror. She suspected something. I did not know what, could not imagine how she had sensed the truth beneath my careful facade. But the instinct of prey told me I had been marked. Lady Vivian was not a woman who let mysteries go unsolved, and I had somehow become a mystery she intended to unravel. I worked on her gowns that evening by candlelight, my fingers moving automatically while my mind raced through possibilities and fears. If she discovered who I was, if she told Edmund, everything would collapse. The life I had built, the safety I had fought for, Clara's future, all of it would crumble to dust. I had to be more careful. I had to be invisible not just to Edmund, but to everyone in that house. And I had to finish my work at Ashworth Hall as quickly as possible before Lady Vivian's curiosity uncovered truths that would destroy us all. But fate, as always, had other plans. It happened on a Saturday, the last day of October, when the trees had shed their leaves and the sky hung low and gray with the promise of winter. I had completed my work for the day and was preparing to leave when the commotion began. Voices in the corridor, running footsteps, a child crying. I emerged from my workroom to find the servants' hall in chaos. Maids rushed past with bowls of water and strips of clean linen, and Mrs. Crawford stood in the center of it all, barking orders with a face pale as chalk. "What has happened?" I asked, catching the arm of a passing footman. His expression was grim. There was an accident in the village. A cart overturned near the school. Several children were injured. The Duke has ordered them brought here. The hall is closer than any doctor. My blood turned to ice. The school. Clara's school. I pushed past him without thought, following the stream of servants toward the front of the house. The entrance hall was crowded with villagers and household staff, and through the press of bodies, I could see figures being carried in, small figures in torn and bloodied clothes. Clara. Where was Clara? I shoved through the crowd, heedless of propriety, of my position, of anything but the desperate need to find my daughter. Voices called after me, hands reached to hold me back, but I fought free of them all, my eyes searching every face, every small body laid out on the marble floor. And then I saw her. She was sitting against the wall near the staircase, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her dress torn at the shoulder. A cut on her forehead bled sluggishly into her dark hair, but she was alive. She was conscious. She was looking around with wide, frightened eyes. Clara. The word tore from my throat before I could stop it, and I ran to her, falling to my knees on the cold stone floor and gathering her into my arms. "Mama," she sobbed, her small body trembling against mine. "Mama, I was so scared." "I am here," I whispered, holding her so tightly I feared I might break her. "I am here. You are safe. I am here." I do not know how long we stayed like that, wrapped around each other on the floor of Ashworth Hall while chaos swirled around us. I only know that when I finally looked up, my cheeks wet with tears and my heart still racing, I found Edmund standing at the foot of the staircase. He was watching us, not with the disinterested gaze of a master surveying his servants, but with something else entirely. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and his eyes, those winter blue eyes, were fixed on Clara with an intensity that stopped my breath. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a ghost. Mrs. Crawford appeared at his elbow, speaking in low, urgent tones about doctors and bandages and which rooms should be prepared for the injured children. But Edmund did not seem to hear her. He stood motionless, his gaze locked on my daughter's face, and I watched the color drain from his features as understanding began to dawn. She had his eyes, his jaw, the particular way his brow furrowed when he was confused or afraid. She was 9 years old, the exact age she would be if she had been conceived the spring before he left for war. And I had just called her by name, had held her like a mother, had revealed in one unguarded moment the secret I had kept for a decade. "Your Grace," Mrs. Crawford said again, more insistently. Edmund blinked, seeming to return to himself. He tore his gaze from Clara and looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my stomach turn to water. Recognition. Not the recognition of a face he might have seen before, but the recognition of a truth he was only beginning to comprehend. "Who is that child?" he asked, and his voice was quiet, dangerous, the voice of a man standing on the edge of an abyss. I opened my mouth to lie, to deflect, to say anything that would turn him away from the truth. But before I could speak, Clara looked up at him with her tear-stained face and answered for me. "I am Clara Nell, sir," she said, her voice small but steady. "My mama works here. She is the seamstress." Edmund's gaze shifted to me, and I felt the weight of it like a physical force. "The seamstress," he repeated slowly. "The seamstress from the village, the one whose voice sounded familiar. The room seemed to shrink around us, the noise of the crowd fading to a distant hum. There was only Edmund and Clara and me locked together in a moment that would shatter everything. "What is your mother's name?" Edmund asked my daughter, though his eyes never left my face. Clara hesitated, looking to me for guidance. "Her name is Mrs. Nell," she said, "but her Christian name is Eleanor." The word hung in the air between us like a blade. Edmund's face went white. His hands, which had been clasped behind his back, fell to his sides and began to tremble. He took one step toward me, then another, and I could see the terrible calculus working behind his eyes, the pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. "Eleanor," he said, and my name on his lips was a wound reopened. Eleanor Ashford. I could not speak. I could only kneel there on the cold marble floor, my arms wrapped around our daughter, and watch as the truth destroyed him. He looked at Clara again, at the shape of her face, the color of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw that was so unmistakably his own. And when he looked back at me, there were tears on his cheeks, tears I had never seen him shed, not even when he left for war. "She is mine," he whispered. "That child is mine." The accusation and the wonder in his voice broke something inside me that I had not known was still whole. "Yes," I said, and the word was barely a breath. "She is yours. She has always been yours." The chaos of the entrance hall seemed to freeze around us. Somewhere in the distance, a child was crying, and Mrs. Crawford was calling for more bandages, but none of it touched us. We were trapped in our own private catastrophe, a reckoning 10 years in the making. Edmund stared at me as though seeing me for the first time, as though the woman kneeling before him bore no resemblance to the servant who had sewn buttons onto his coat, and perhaps she did not. Perhaps Eleanor Ashford had been there all along, hiding just beneath the surface of Mrs. Nell, waiting for this moment to emerge. 10 years, he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "You have been alive for 10 years, and you let me believe." He could not finish the sentence. He turned away, one hand pressed against his forehead, his shoulders shaking with an emotion I could not name. And I remained where I was, frozen in the wreckage of my own secrets, holding our daughter close and waiting for the storm to break. It had happened. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The hours that followed were a blur of motion and necessity. The injured children required attention, and Edmund, whatever turmoil raged within him, was still the master of this house and responsible for those brought under its roof. He turned from me without another word, his face a mask of stone, and began issuing orders to the servants with the cold efficiency of a man who had commanded soldiers in battle. Doctors were summoned, rooms were prepared, parents were sent for. The machinery of crisis ground into action, and I was swept along with it, tending to Clara's cut and keeping her calm while the chaos swirled around us. But I felt his eyes on me. Even as he moved through the entrance hall, directing servants and speaking with the village doctor, I felt him watching. And every time I looked up, I found him looking away, as though he could not bear to hold my gaze for more than a moment. It was nearly midnight before the house fell quiet. The injured children had been settled into guest rooms, their families gathered at their bedsides, and the servants had retreated to their quarters to catch what rest they could before dawn. Clara slept in a small chamber off the nursery, her forehead bandaged and her breathing peaceful, unaware that her world had shifted on its axis. I sat beside her bed in the darkness, unwilling to leave her, unwilling to face what waited beyond that door. But I could not hide forever. And when the soft knock came, I knew who stood on the other side. I rose and crossed to the door, opening it to find Edmund in the corridor, a single candle in his hand casting flickering shadows across his face. He looked older than he had that morning, aged by the revelations of the day, and there were circles beneath his eyes that spoke of exhaustion beyond the physical. "We need to speak," he said quietly. "Not here. My study." I glanced back at Clara, still sleeping soundly, and nodded. I followed him through the darkened corridors of Ashworth Hall, our footsteps echoing in the silence until we reached a heavy oak door at the end of a long passage. He opened it and stood aside for me to enter. The study was warm, a fire still burning low in the grate, and books lined every wall from floor to ceiling. A desk dominated the center of the room, covered with papers and correspondence, and 2 leather chairs faced the hearth. Edmund gestured toward one of them, and I sat, my hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. He did not sit. He stood by the fire, his back to me, staring into the flames as though searching for words in their depths. "I wrote to you," he said at last, "every week for 18 months. I sent letters from the front, from field hospitals, from every God-forsaken outpost the army stationed me in. I poured my heart onto those pages. I told you about the battles, the fear, the moments when I thought I would die, and my only regret was that I had not made you my wife before I left." His voice was raw, stripped of the coldness that had marked it since his return to England. This was not the Duke of Hartmore speaking. This was Edmund, the boy I had loved, wounded and bleeding before me. "I never received them," I whispered. He turned to face me, and the anguish in his eyes was almost too much to bear. "I know that now. Mrs. Crawford told me what she learned when I purchased this estate. Your father died 6 months after I left. The creditors took everything, your family home, your possessions, your reputation. You disappeared, and no one knew where you had gone." I swallowed hard. My father had intercepted your letters. I did not know until after his death, when I found them hidden in his study, still sealed. He did not want me to wait for a man who might never return. He thought he was protecting me. Edmund closed his eyes, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "And my letters to you?" I asked. "Did he intercept those as well?" "I wrote," I said. "For months, I wrote. But my letters were returned unopened. I assumed you had changed your mind, that the promises you made were those of a young man who had not yet seen war, and that war had shown you the foolishness of binding yourself to a baron's daughter with no fortune and no prospects." He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before my chair, taking my hands in his. His grip was almost painful, but I did not pull away. "I never stopped loving you," he said fiercely, "not for one moment. When I returned from the war and found you gone, when everyone told me you had vanished without a word, I thought you had abandoned me. I thought you had found someone else, someone who could offer you more than a scarred soldier with nightmares and a title he never wanted." He pressed his forehead to our joined hands. "I have spent 10 years hating myself for not being enough, 10 years believing I had driven you away." Tears slipped down my cheeks, and I made no effort to stop them. "I sold the locket," I said. "The one you gave me. I sold it to survive. I was pregnant with Clara and starving, and I had nothing left in the world except that piece of gold with our initials engraved inside." Edmund lifted his head, and I saw that he was crying too, tears cutting tracks through the dust and weariness on his face. "I found it," he said. 2 weeks ago. Around Vivian's neck. I know. I saw it." He released my hands and rose, pacing toward the fire with the restless energy of a caged animal. When I saw those initials, I thought I was losing my mind. I demanded to know where she had gotten it. She told me she purchased it from a jeweler in London who had acquired it from a shop in York. I traced it back to the pawnbroker myself. He remembered you, Eleanor. A young woman, desperately thin, with dark hair and haunted eyes. He said you wept when you handed it over." "I did," I whispered. "I wept for days afterward." He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression torn between grief and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "I came to Yorkshire to find you," he said. "I purchased this estate because the pawnbroker's records showed an address in this county. I have had men searching for weeks, looking for any trace of Eleanor Ashford. And all this time you were here, in my house, sewing my linens and avoiding my gaze. I could not risk discovery, I said. I had built a life for Clara, a safe life, away from scandal and whispers. If anyone learned she was illegitimate, if anyone connected her to you, her future would be destroyed. I could not let that happen. So you hid from me. You let me believe you were dead. The accusation stung, but I could not deny its truth. Yes, I let you believe I was dead. Because I thought you had abandoned me. Because I believed you had received my letters and chosen not to respond. Because I thought you did not want me anymore. He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched the war playing out behind his eyes. Anger and love, betrayal and understanding. The tangled wreckage of two lives destroyed by silence and circumstance. She has my eyes, he said finally, his voice breaking. Clara. She has my eyes. Yes. He crossed back to my chair and knelt before me again, cupping my face in his hands with a tenderness that shattered me. I have a daughter, he said wonderingly. I have a daughter I never knew existed. And I have you. He pressed his forehead to mine, his breath warm against my lips. Tell me I have not lost you again. Tell me there is still time to make this right. I closed my eyes, and the tears fell faster. There is so much between us, I whispered. So much pain. So many years lost. I do not care about the years. I care about the years to come. Marry me, Eleanor. Let me give you and Clara the life you should have had. Let me spend whatever time remains making up for everything you have suffered. I pulled back to look at him, searching his face for any trace of doubt or hesitation. But there was none. Only love, naked and absolute, the same love I had seen in his eyes the night he gave me the locket. What about Lady Vivian? I asked. What about your reputation? Vivian means nothing to me. She never did. She was a distraction, a way to fill the emptiness you left behind. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something that caught the firelight with a familiar golden gleam. The locket. He pressed it into my hands. I took this from her the night I discovered where it came from. She is gone from this house and will not return. I looked down at the locket, at the initials still engraved inside, E and E intertwined, like two souls reaching for each other across impossible distances. I had thought it lost forever. I had thought everything lost forever. But here it was, returned to me at last. And here was Edmund, kneeling before me with tears on his face and love in his eyes, offering me everything I had given up hope of ever having. Yes, I said, and the word was a prayer and a promise. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed me then, for the first time in 10 years, and it was nothing like the gentle kisses we had shared beneath the willow tree. This was a kiss born of desperation and relief, of grief finally transmuted into joy. I wrapped my arms around him and held on as though I might drown without him, and when we finally broke apart, we were both trembling. There will be scandal, I said. People will talk. Let them talk. He brushed a strand of hair from my face, his touch so gentle it made me want to weep all over again. I am a duke. I can weather scandal. And you are the mother of my child, the only woman I have ever loved. I do not care what society says. I care only that you are mine again. We stayed in his study until dawn, talking through the night, unraveling the misunderstandings that had kept us apart for so long. He told me about the war, about the wounds both visible and invisible that he still carried. I told him about the years of poverty and fear, about building a life from nothing, about the fierce joy of watching Clara grow into a person of courage and kindness. And when the sun rose over Yorkshire, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, we went together to the nursery to wake our daughter. Clara, I said softly, kneeling beside her bed, there is someone I want you to meet. She blinked awake, her eyes focusing on Edmund standing behind me. her brow furrowed with confusion, and then with the beginning of understanding. "Is he?" she started, but the words faltered. Edmund knelt beside me, his eyes never leaving her face. "I am your father," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I did not know you existed until yesterday. But now that I do, I intend to spend the rest of my life making up for every moment I missed." Clara looked at me, her winter blue eyes searching for confirmation. I nodded, tears streaming down my cheeks. "It is true, sweetheart. He is your father, and he loves you very much." She studied Edmund for a long moment, this stranger who was not a stranger, this man whose face she saw reflected in the mirror every day. And then, with the simple courage that had always defined her, she reached out and took his hand. "I always wondered," she said quietly. "I always wondered what he looked like." Edmund gathered her into his arms, and I watched him hold our daughter for the first time, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I moved closer, wrapping my arms around them both, and we stayed that way as the morning light flooded through the windows of Ashworth Hall. We were married 3 weeks later in the small stone church in Thornwick, with only the household staff and a few villagers in attendance. I wore a gown of pale blue silk that I had sewn myself, and Clara stood beside me as my witness, her dark curls crowned with white winter roses. Edmund spoke his vows in a voice that trembled with emotion, and when the vicar pronounced us man and wife, the sound of church bells rang out across the frozen hills. There was scandal, of course. London society whispered about the Duke who had married his seamstress, about the child who had appeared from nowhere, about the secrets that must have been kept. But Edmund was right. He was a duke, and dukes could weather scandal. And as the weeks turned to months, as Clara took her rightful place as the daughter of Ashworth Hall, the whispers faded to silence. I still wear the locket. It hangs around my neck as I write these words, warm against my skin, its golden chain a reminder of everything I lost and everything I found again. Some nights, when the fire burns low and the house is quiet, I open it and trace the initials engraved inside, E and E, intertwined forever. Edmund finds me like this sometimes, lost in memory, and he pulls me close and presses his lips to my hair. We do not speak of the years we lost. We speak only of the years to come, of the life we are building together, of the daughter who runs through the halls of Ashworth with laughter in her voice and joy in her eyes. I was 20 years old when I sold my soul for 12 shillings and 6pence. I was 30 when I found it again, returned to me by the man I never stopped loving, in a house I never expected to call home. Some things once lost are never meant to be found again. But some things, against all odds, find their way back, and that, I have learned, is the truest kind of love.